Pete Winfield, teacher, mentor, friend, father, grandfather, and husband. All the things he was are now sadly to be said in the past tense. Pete passed away after a short illness, and this news has made me so very sad. Pete taught me for just the 1 year at Peter Symonds College, Winchester. This was between 2004 and 2005, where he introduced me to Philip Larkin. In 2009, I made contact with Pete upon completing my dissertation about Larkin, and he was kind enough to respond in his usual affable way. We maintained email contact, and when I was due to come back from my time in Korea, he made time for me, and we met for a pint and some lunch in Winchester. That very first time was in the Exchange on St Cross Road, but every time thereafter was exclusively at the Wickham Arms. The Wickham was the perfect setting and became a lovely bolt hole from the world whenever we'd walk through that cylindrical door. Pete would always insist on buying the first round. London Pride for him, customary HSB for me. We'd often meet at lunchtime and would have the place to ourselves, watching it fill up around us as we discussed current affairs, Shakespeare, poetry, family, teaching, and pretty much any subject under the sun. He had this towering talent for making you feel like you were the most important person in the room, as well as a wicked sense of humour that was classy, never cruel, unless discussing certain ministers at Whitehall. He treated me like an equal, rather than the intellectual pipsqueak I was. He was also a real driving force in making this podcast into what it is. When I lost my wonderful father in 2022, I did a double take when I saw Pete's tall form stood at the back of the crematorium in his dark blue sunglasses that I always thought made him look like he should have been playing saxophone in a jazz band. It's something I never got to fully thank him for, but it meant and still means the world to me that he was there for me in my time of need. His last WhatsApp message to me was to tell me he'd been taken ill, was hoping to see me at some point in the summer, but that for now he wouldn't be able to meet up with me in person. And it got me thinking about our last in-person meeting, because it was actually a memorable one, if only because he gave me a hug at the end, rather than our usual firm handshake. And he told me to do something which resonates especially now. He looked me dead in the eyes, and he told me to keep the fire. So, though Pete has gone, I would like to present a special episode in which I will tackle 4 of our favourite Larkin poems. I'm going to do my best not to be maudlin, because you wouldn't want that. But please think of this as my tribute to him, his teaching, his kindness, and his life. He passed the fire to me, and now I will do my best to honour it. This episode is simply going to be called 4 for Pete. I fished out my old copy of High Windows. So in the September of 2004, and I've got it written on the inside cover here, in my scrawly adolescent biro, Joe Riley, PSC, Peter Symonds College, 2004. And obviously, this was the collection that we did. And I'm sitting currently in my car with the rain sort of plonking down, which sort of matches the mood here a little bit, but this is one of a few different settings over the next few days as I record this, so think of this as more the introduction to Larkin, Peter, and myself. And I remember being really quite intimidated by the concept of studying poetry. I've said this in other ways on other episodes, but obviously if you're just dropping by and this is the first time you're listening, welcome. I'm going to talk a little bit just about how the book looks. This is a Faber and Faber, as almost all Larkin was. And I remember picking this up UK $6.99, and I believe I did all my shopping at Smith's on the High Street at the time. I remember picking up this copy of the book and looking at it, and it just looked very dry. It's got this illustration of the sun shining in through some windows, which, frankly looks a bit juvenile to me now. I also read the bit at the back which says, when Philip Larkin's High Windows first appeared, Kingsley Amis spoke for a large and loyal readership when he wrote, Larkin's admirers need only be told that he is as good as ever here, if not slightly better. Like Betjeman and Hardy, Larkin is a poet who can move a large audience to laughter and to tears without betraying the highest artistic standards. This is a profoundly beautiful and remarkable book. That quote there was from Alan Brownjohn of the New Statesman. So, 20 years ago, as it was, a pleb called Joe Riley, then 17 years old, picked this book up, probably read the blurb at the back and went, I've heard of Hardy, but I don't know who Betjeman is. Who the hell's Kingsley Amis? Ugh. And I think I probably would have turned to the contents, seen the names of the poems, and it's just mad to me to think that this would be the collection of poetry which started me off on the journey of becoming a lover of poetry. When I was at school, probably the best way to describe it is I had some solid but uninspiring teachers. And that probably says a lot about me as a student. I got scarred by being put into a low set when I was in year 9 because my maths was no good, it still is no good. And because they were doing it across the board, it averaged out that I ended up having to go into a lower English set, when actually I was always good at English. I always loved English. I read a lot. Okay, I didn't read the classics so much, but I read a lot. And I loved writing. I loved creative writing. That was always my thing. So, to suddenly be given this sort of feeling of I'm in a class full of dickheads who didn't care about what we were doing. And my dad was actually very, very sort of passionate about poetry, even though he didn't write it. Not that he ever let on. And he especially was passionate about some of the war poets, Owen and Sassoon and Brooke. And that was definitely a step in the right direction for me. I think a lot of boys have that when they're shown men, real men, warriors, fighting, but also writing. And the truth is obviously a lot more complex than that, as I might do an episode on Wilfred Owen at some point in the future. The idea of picking up a collection of poetry by someone I didn't know, and I'd seen a picture of Larkin, I think, in a brief look at the prospectus and thinking, Jesus, who's this bloke? Looks like a frog with glasses. Really, what I should have said was looks like a toad. But that's a whole other thing. If I'd picked up this collection of poetry age 17 and just read it, it might have had an effect. I don't know. I can't tell you. But I know that the alchemy of this poetry collection being taught by Pete, it was pure magic. So I'm not going to do the whole collection, that would be crazy. I've got to pick 4. And I may not even pick 4 from just this collection, but I'll definitely pick some. In terms of ones that I've already covered, again, if you're just coming to this, I have already covered This Be the Verse, about this time last year actually, and the weather couldn't be more different. I have already covered Cut Grass, The Building, The Trees. I suppose a fun place to start would be the poem itself, High Windows, which we didn't do first. I think we went through the poem in chronological order, or my memory of it is unfortunately going to be maybe a little unreliable. I feel like we started with This Be the Verse. I remember, and it wouldn't surprise me at all if Pete had stepped forward and decided to throw that one out there as a sort of first time to get everybody in the room hooked. It certainly worked. I remember this kindly looking older gentleman, and he was older. That was the thing as well. It's worth remembering about Pete. He had come back to teaching, having had some time away. He was a qualified teacher, but also again, this always blows my mind because I told you my maths is not the best. He also had a sideline in financial advising, which I think is just incredible. So he was able to, from what I gather, from what he told me, and if I've got it wrong, that he was able to dip in and out of teaching a little bit more, especially when he got older, and especially when his kids were older. His wife stayed being a teacher, and I think he essentially said, I can take this or leave it, and doing sixth form, of course, meant that he didn't get quite the same pressure by being part-time. He could sort of take certain classes and move around. So in a way, I experienced Pete at a very different point in his life to maybe if I'd had him when he was younger and maybe more stressed with all the toad work of what teaching can be like. And Peter Simmons was a pretty intense place. I remember being quite alarmed, actually, by how robotic everything felt. I was there with all these kids who were from the Winchester schools, who were very sort of driven, and I don't mind admitting the only reason I actually went to Peter Simmons over Barton Peveril, which was the other college down the road, and I lived equidistant to both. The only reason I went to Peter Simmons was because on the open evening I was accosted by this girl who I still think, and, you know, besides my beautiful wife, was the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen in my life. And I just remember she just said, do you want to do English literature? And I said, absolutely. Where do I sign? Quick. You know, by the way, I love you. I've never been so utterly bewitched. And, and then before I knew it, I'm walking into an English lit classroom thinking, I'm not sure about this. There's a lot of reading, a lot of books. Everyone else here seems really, really clever. And the other members of the department were great. But there was obviously a different style of teaching at further education, which I was not totally ready for. I think it did me a lot of good. But looking back on it now and being an educator myself, I realised that I was definitely a student who I would be saying they need a bit of a kick in the arse, this one. And Pete duly did that in a story that I'll tell later on in this episode, I'm sure. But back to that first time, I remember him standing in front of us in a sort of grandfatherly sense, but there was a real sense with Pete. While he was kind, he had these big glasses, he had this like slightly, you know, his hair can't have been all white when I saw him first time, but it was definitely very much greying. I would have placed him at that point. And he used to wear quite sort of casual but smart sort of chinos, and, you know, in the summer he'd stick his sandals on. He was very he was casual and fun and nice and gentle looking. But he also had a real don't fuck with me sort of look on his face, which I loved, because he was just a regular bloke who could talk to you about other things. He wasn't precious, he wasn't sort of pretentious. He was actually just a really decent guy, and really showed through. And I liked the way that he spoke to people. I liked the way that he always treated people with respect, but he didn't allow time wasters, he didn't allow bullshitters, and I think that was why I respected him so much. But back to the poem, High Windows. I remember I was still shocked, probably even a couple of weeks in, that now I was out of school and I didn't call my teachers Miss or Mr. something, that I was in a room with an adult who was using bad language. And in Pete's case, he wasn't doing it for his kicks, although there were some teachers that did. Pete very much was quoting, and he made no apologies for it, and I think that's really important. And as the years have gone on, 20 years on, I do think we're actually in a bit more trouble in education now about freedom of speech and what you can and can't say in an educating sense, because the world has changed and people are far more sensitive, I think, than maybe they were back then. It doesn't shock me that Larkin isn't on the syllabus anymore, because I think there are too many people who would use the word problematic. I hate that word, by the way. I think it's so utterly devoid of any real meaning. You know, don't call something problematic. Talk about why it is maybe no longer a nice thing to use that word, and then look at it in context. And while you're looking at it in context, give yourself a bit of a slap and say, it was written by somebody who's long dead, And even when they were dying in the 80s, a lot of these words were completely fine. Doesn't change some of the other stuff about Larkin, which I'm always a little bit conflicted with. But we're talking about poetry here, and if it's in the poem, it's getting said out loud. High windows. When I see a couple of kids and guess he's fucking her, and she's taking pills or wearing a diaphragm, I know this is paradise. Everyone old has dreamed of all their lives. Bonds and gestures pushed to one side, like an outdated combine harvester, and everyone young, going down the long slide to happiness, endlessly. I wonder if anyone looked at me 40 years back and thought, that'll be the life. No God anymore, or sweating in the dark about hell and that, having to hide what you think of the priest. He and his lot will all go down the long slide like three bloody birds. And immediately, rather than words, comes the thought of high windows, the sun comprehending glass, and beyond it, the deep blue air that shows nothing, and is nowhere, and is endless. I think I've chosen this poem first because it was actually one that Pete and I discussed a few times, and obviously he got to see me grow up a bit. You know, he knew me as a teenager, and then saw me throughout my sort of 20s, and saw me, now I'm in my 30s, you know, and he saw me become a teacher and then a father, you know, a husband. He saw me throughout different stages of my life, and it was funny how, to me, he just always seemed to be exactly the same, and it's just weird and wrong to think that, because of course he was going through his own changes, of course. But it's a fascinating little poem, High Windows, and I always like this. We'll move away from the biographical information about it being about Larkin's home that he was at in Hull, with these huge sort of windows that he would often sit and write at, or sit and look out of. Although that is there, it's a poem about aging, and it's a poem about the world moving on without you. And it's kind of why it's quite relevant, really, to what I was just saying. Here am I reflecting on a time that was 20 years ago and feels like yesterday, but also looking at it from how social attitudes change. Now, Larkin, obviously, writing this, I'm looking at some of my notes here. You know, I've written the pill and, you know, sexual revolution. Of course, you know, this is all information that most people would know. You know, the idea of more liberal attitudes being given towards sex and sexual intercourse. Larkin, of course, being himself obsessed with sex, aren't we all? And having this real idea of, you know, this is what every generation does. Every generation gets a bit jealous of either the generation above them or the generation below them, or both. Every generation has this angst that we haven't had it quite so good, or we're not going to have it as good. By it, I don't just mean sex, I mean like life. And in a way, if you think about Larkin's era, you know, he's the generation that would be looking at the world and going, Christ, we've had to live through, you know, world wars. We've had to live through, you know, real austerity, but then of course post-war boom. He's had to live through the massive changes in society and political changes, but also he grew up at a time where, you know, for him, for his lifestyle, he was able to make a living by being a librarian. He also was a poet. He was paid to write. All those things now seem borderline laughable if you wanted to make a living out of those things, at least with the current cost of living crisis. But then you've got to look at the attitudes towards sex, and also the attitudes towards religion. Another really big aspect of Larkin's life was this disparagement of religion, combined with a real fear that, yeah, but what if I'm wrong? and how other people similar to him may have looked at him and gone, oh God, that'll be the life, no God anymore. Sweating in the dark about hell and that, or having to hide what you think of the priest. It's such a strange poem because it starts, the first stanza is all base crudeness and sort of, it feels horrible to read it aloud, and guess he's fucking her. That doesn't need to be there. He doesn't need to start that. He doesn't need to say that. He could say, and guess he's sleeping with her. Or guess he's having sex with her if he really wanted to be naughty. Guess he's bonking her. He doesn't say that, though. He says fucking because it's a shock. And like all schoolboys, they like to shock. And it's funny how it goes from this first stanza to this commentary and this quotation from an older person who has really had it tough in their mind. And it's bookended at either side with this real contrast, real extreme. The base sort of coarseness of the opening then gives way to this reaching for something out of reach. It's the real sort of almost reminds me a little bit of Rossetti's De Profundis, why is heaven set so far, and saying that she has to try to catch at hope. The sense that you can't reach it easily. It's just out of reach. In fact, that's kind of its whole point. And this sense of perspective, that rather than words, rather than thoughts, rather than actually anything coherent, is just high windows. And I've always wondered if the high windows are both transcendent or even possibly imprisoning, because you would think of high windows within a prison cell. If life is like a prison, we can only really look outside, we can't be there yet. But this idea of the sun comprehending glass gets used a lot. The flashes of windscreens are used, of course, in the Whitsun weddings, and this idea of something reflecting but not being. And it says that is nothing and is nowhere and is endless. I do remember the first time reading the end of that poem in Peter's lesson, and I got a little shiver, which I wasn't expecting from a poem. It really got to me. And Pete, credit to him, said, and if you want to know what that ending actually means, I'm not really sure either. But isn't it amazing? And it was the first time I'd heard somebody say, sometimes you've just got to appreciate how it might make you feel. It doesn't mean that you understand it. And that for me was a real eye-opener. A wonderful, wonderful poem, and one that I'm really so pleased that I got the chance to hear coming from him, because had I read that on my own, I don't know. Maybe it wouldn't quite have been the same. I've been given access to the site at Peter Simmons College, and understandably they're a little bit hesitant to let me just walk around on site recording, even over audio. But I worked my magic, and here we are. I forgot how many trees there were. So I've walked up to the Varley building, which is where Pete would have given me that dose of Larkin way back in that autumn of 2004. Now I can't go in the building because there are limits to this particular tour, and the building at the moment is currently locked pending some renovations, but I can, and I hope that no one minds. I'm going to just sneak up to the window here, which is open. There it is, there's the classroom. Wow. It's strange how things just look very small in reality. I don't think of it as being anything too special as a classroom after all, but it's very small, modest classroom, just like loads of ones I've taught in over the years now. But a very a very strange moment just looking at it and thinking, wow, actually not much has changed at all. The desk is still in the same place, or at least seems to be. And yeah, I've got this memory of Pete standing right there with this particular copy of Larkin in his hand, and belting forth. It's quite strange walking around the site again, because it's reminded me of how utterly intimidated I felt by being at a place like this. And maybe that's part of why I remember Pete so keenly, is because he was an oasis of kindness. And, he didn't know who I was, he didn't know where I was from, he had no sort of issue with, the fact that I was from a different school to some of the other kids. He didn't give a shit. He was just the teacher. I respected him for that, because it would probably be quite easy to just pick on the most confident kid. I mean, I made up for my lack of ability with a real show of confidence, which was entirely misplaced. Probably why, and I can say this now, I'm looking back at it, and I remember distinctly the door with which I was sent back through with my tail between my legs when, in our first couple of sessions, he told us to go away and annotate a particular poem. I think it was, in fact, High Windows poem. And I hadn't really done it. I sort of thought I could get away with turning up and copying someone else's annotations. And I was wrong. I got called out. And Pete said, "Okay, Joe, how about yourself?" And I said, and I made the foolish error of making a sweeping statement saying, it doesn't really rhyme, does it? And that's kind of the whole point of it. It's not supposed to rhyme, because then it makes it feel more real, which I thought was really bloody clever. And he just looked at me over those glasses, these steely eyes, and he said, "Doesn't rhyme?" And everyone else sort of turned to look at me like I was the moron that I was. And he said, "Okay, if you had actually annotated it or paid it any kind of attention, you see that it does rhyme, and it's incredibly tight, the rhyme. Have you done any of the other work I've asked you to do?" And I sort of fessed up that I hadn't. And he said, "Okay, I'm going to ask you to get your things and fuck off." And I left that room going, "Oh, okay." And I slunk out to the library, my face burning. And it did me a world of good. So after my little tour of Peter Simmons, I've taken a nice sort of detour, if you like. Totally unplanned, but sometimes they're the best moments. And I'm currently walking at quite an incline up the side of St. Catherine's Hill. So bear with me. This doesn't have a particular link with Pete, at least not explicitly, but I was trying to think of a nice quiet spot where I could read the next poem, and suddenly drawn to the idea of being able to have a little bit of a view. Now, Winchester, if you've never been, is like a lot of Roman cities and sort of Saxon fortress and strongholds. It's built on hills, and one of the things that I've always remembered, as I'm getting increasingly out of breath here, is that if you want to climb around Winchester, you've got to really pack an extra pair of lungs. It's not easy at all. So there's a chalk ridge up the side of St. Catherine's Hill. This is not the route I'm used to taking. Certainly when I was a kid, my mum, dad and I and my sister would come up St. Catherine's around the main side where there are big steps cut into it. So what you're currently hearing is a 37-year-old dad who has been fitter, it's easy to say, attempting to climb up the other side which has no steps and is all loose chalk. Oh yeah, and I'm doing it in Birkenstocks as well, so there's a moral to this story. I think it's don't be me. But any minute now, when I reach this summit, I will turn around, oh wow, and there it is, and be greeted with quite the view. And in fact, perfect, exactly what I wanted. Directly north of me is Peter Simmons College. There's the building I was in earlier. It looks like a miniature. Over there's a cathedral. The other side is St. Cross. Underneath me, like a thread, is the River Itchen. Now, I've tried to make sure that this episode feels distinct because I didn't want it to become about me so much, and I certainly didn't want it to become about Dad, but maybe part of this is me recognising my own thought processes. Pete and my dad met once at a parents' evening where I think Pete's advice was very enthusiastic, needs to button down and do some work, to which my dad would have said, yep, I agree. So they had me right on that front. But in a way there were two sides of a similar coin. Pete was a different type of man to my dad in some ways, and also very much not the case. He was a nice, hard-working bloke, loved his family, loved his football, etc. I think the difference was that, certainly as I got older, Pete became more of a mentor in lots of ways that my dad necessarily couldn't. Because he didn't have the university background, he didn't have a background in teaching or education, and so Pete filled a gap that my dad wasn't able to. Loving and caring and decent a man as my dad was, he didn't know some of the stuff that Pete knew. And so I'm mentioning my dad because standing right here and seeing this exact view, it's making me a little bit emotional, because we used to come up here all the time when I was a little kid. I mean, it was a definite, now I am a parent, I look at it and I say, yep, that's a definite Sunday job, that. What else do we do to tire the kids out? Let's get them out and about, make them run around, take them up and down a hill, and off you go. That'll tire them out in time, so they go to bloody sleep. Standing here brings back so many memories. When I was getting towards the end of my time with Pete, in first year of Peter Simmons, he was actually the one that gave me a copy of Wits and Weddings, because I told him how much I'd loved Philip Larkin's poems in High Windows. I thought they were excellent, and I asked, was there any other collection that he might recommend, and he said, in his humble opinion, High Windows is good, but Wits and Weddings is better. Certainly had more of his favourite poems in there. And I never really quite remember if he lent me his copy, if he gave me his copy. I've definitely gone and bought it a couple of times in second-hand shops, and I've obviously got the collected poems, so my memory lets me down on that one, but I do remember picking it up. And actually one of the first poems I read, even though I didn't read them in order, I just opened it on a random page, and I remember this poem very clearly. The poem's called Days, and sitting up here it feels just right. Days. What are days for? Days are where we live. They come, they wake us, time and time over. They are to be happy in. Where can we live but days? Solving that question brings the priest and the doctor in their long coats, running over the fields. Well, that's got me a bit, that one. I think because it's early August and we've had such a hot summer and we've had all this rain and everything looks beautiful and green. You know, everywhere I look, it's stunning. And of course, all these sort of rolling fields ahead of me and trees everywhere. It's sort of I can really see these two characters, the only two characters in this poem, this priest and this doctor. And I do feel like this poem for me was one of the ones that made me really stop and go, oh wow. Because I think a lot of Larkin's more shocking poems, especially in High Windows, you know, with the dropping of the F word, etc. They're fine, they're good, very good, great even. But he had this understated lyric ability, which I think is very evident in Cut Grass, and of course in this poem too. And maybe the reason why I've felt a little bit of a lump in my throat with that one is because I'm still coming to terms with Pete passing. I'm still coming to terms with my dad passing. I'm still coming to terms with the fact that anybody dies, really. I find it very, very difficult. And the priest and the doctor in their long coats running over the fields. I've always said, if I've ever taught this poem, my opening question is, are they running towards or are they running away? And sometimes I get a row of blank faces looking at me going, what? But I think it's an important question. Are these characters, are these archetypes running away or from? In my mind, they're always running away. I've always had this very clear image of the priest and the doctor. They're completely statuesque in their sort of stride length. They're both running and they're both neck and neck. And I mean, they're both men. I suppose that's the stereotyping for you. But they are both running away from me but towards something, and I never know what that something is. And it's a fun question to pose, really, because really this is a poem about the idea of when it's all done, when it's all over, what else can we do? Where else can we go? Well, the answer is obvious to that one. Where can we live but days? We can't. We can't live if there are no days left for us. And I think reading it now with Pete in the past tense, it was a poem that I remember we discussed numerous times. And I think he always said that he loved the idea that both the priest and the doctor were these two agents of comfort in crisis, but also of futility. If you're really ill, the doctor sometimes is the one that says, I'm sorry guys, there's nothing we can do. And the priest is the one that will say, we will commend them to God, because there's nothing more we can do here. And you take those two sort of almost, well, if you wanted to be harsh, you'd say imposters. You'd say people that claim they can change things and they can't. It links massively with, of course, Larkin's overall lack of belief and faith in religion. But of course, towards the end, Larkin himself was very, very sick and very unwell and did not have anything they could do for him. Of course, a lot of it was self-inflicted. There were things he could have done differently. And his life towards the end was one of real misery. But in a way, that's our conundrum. We're humans, we're alive right now. And we sometimes forget how amazing that is. Here I am, walking down. I found some steps, by the way, thank God. Walking down this incline with my shadow behind me and the sun in my face, going, I'm alive right now, I can do this. And one day, hopefully a long way away, if there's even still any way of listening to this, you know, my voice will be an echo of someone that I was. And I'm lucky enough I live within a technological time that I can transmit it out there. for lots of people throughout history, for the majority of people throughout human history, that has not been the case, and all that is left is their memory. And this question of, where can we live but days, but also the bit at the beginning of, they come and wake us time and time over. And I think of all the times I've woken up and going, oh God, I don't want to go in, I don't want to do this, I don't want to wake up, I want to stay here. It's a good antidote to the depressive nature that I'm sure Larkin definitely had, and I think most of us have in some way. I'm not a morning person, but to feel like waking up is a privilege. What a shot in the arm that would be every morning if you woke up and went, wow, I'm here, let's get up, let's do stuff, let's get out there. Because you don't know. And I wonder if people who get a diagnosis, a terminal diagnosis, begin to feel that way. Or do they go the other way and they say, you know what, sod this. Getting up isn't going to change anything. Being up and about isn't going to make me better. I don't know. But that bit of they are to be happy in has that nice dollop of Larkin-esque sort of sarcastic, oh go on then, you're supposed to be happy in that. And it's made me think about time as well. I think the poem does a wonderful job of sort of contracting time, the span of one person's life. And now I think about Pete being gone. Sorry, it's just I'm looking across Peter Simmons now. I can still see it in the distance, and I was just there, and when I was being taught by Pete was only 20 years ago. It's not that long at all, and it feels like it was a minute ago, and yet it feels like it was 100 years ago. And I think as you get older, time does have this weird elastic quality to it, where it both feels like it's going to go on forever, but also it's so short. And I think of what was going on for him at that time, and I don't know. This is the thing, there's a large part of his life that I don't know anything about. I don't know what he was experiencing at the time and all of that, but I think why I keep bringing it back to him and his sort of way of being is that to demystify life through poetry, I think is true magic and true craft. And I suppose that reading that poem in this setting, I hope it's made you read it and think about it too in those ways. You didn't know Pete. Maybe you did. But you know yourself and you know your own life, and the idea of solving that question. I love that word, solving. Like it needs to be solved, like it's a problem, like it's an equation. And I think life is not an equation. It's not a maths problem. One of the things that I've decided to do today, after yesterday's Winchester-centric recording, is I've kept it local. I've sort of had to, really, with childcare and other such stuff. So I'm currently in the tiny little picturesque village of Greywell, which is just down the road from me. And it couldn't be more of a sort of feeling of August. It's about 23 degrees, it's beautiful and sunny, but it isn't too hot and sort of stifling or humid. The cows are chewing away at what they can get over there in the field, and I'm walking a gravel path sort of flanked on either side with ivy and hedgerow to try and, do this next poem. One thing that I was really struck by whenever I talked with Pete I never really quite got the measure of what he thought about religion and God. I think it was actually one of the few subjects that we didn't absolutely discuss directly. And it's a strange one for me because it's actually quite a fundamental thing, if you pardon the pun. Now, people who listened to this before will know that I have a somewhat unapologetic approach to this, and that is that I'm afraid you have to show me proof before I can really believe in something. And as of right now, I don't have enough. That doesn't mean that I disrespect people who are religious. In fact, I'd say I go the opposite. I respect them more because I think it takes real bravery and faith to believe something that I haven't seen any evidence for myself. And so you can probably guess where this is going. I feel that one of my early episodes that I was really excited about doing was church going. Last year, I took my cycle clips off. I didn't actually have any on in the first place, but I took my bike down to a church not too far from me and did the reading in there. I had the place to myself, and it was very, very cold and wet and not very nice that day. Today couldn't be more opposite to that, and yet here I am at a different church. And true story, that episode, as of right now, despite it being over a year old, has very, very few downloads. I think it's one that people don't go for. And yet it was definitely a poem that Pete used to always talk to me about. He always used to say how much he loved this poem. He said it was a real favourite of his. He said it really showed for him the quintessential Larkin. So, somewhat self-consciously, I'm stood outside a particular church in Greywell. So I'm going to head inside and see what happens.
Maybe bits of Oban and, I say, the castle area and along to Upton Gray and places like that.
Fantastic.
Yes.
That was okay.
Yeah, no, definitely. If you're around here and move around, then you'll have the light on here still. But if you go somewhere else, then the light will go off.
Thankfully,
so don't be surprised.
it's purely audio, but I know what you mean. I don't want to suddenly...
Well, yeah, no, suddenly you're here, you go dark in this bit, and you'll say, oh, God. Yeah, no, carry on.
On a dark evening, that would be quite alarming, I imagine.
Yes. Well, this is the thing about this church, and we don't have windows on this side.
No, I just noticed that.
So, it's nice at this time of day. You have got light coming into this main body, but I'm so pleased that we have got these automatic lights now, because in the winter and at other points of the day it can be really quite dark in here.
Were there ever windows? Or is it just,
yes. Let us muse. I don't know. I don't know if anybody. No.
Is it shut or?
No. Open's great. Yeah.
If you could just shut it when you leave.
No problem.
What do you reckon?
I'll shut it as I leave, and then that way people won't think it's closed or anything.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Once I am sure there's nothing going on, I step inside, letting the door thud shut. Another church, matting, seats and stone, and little books, sprawlings of flowers cut for Sunday, brownish now, some brass and stuff up at the holy end, the small neat organ, and a tense, musty, unignorable silence brewed God knows how long, hatless. I take off my cycle clips in awkward reverence, move forward, run my hand around the font. From where I stand, the roof looks almost new, cleaned or restored. Someone would know, I don't. Mounting the lectern, I peruse a few hectoring large-scale verses and pronounce, "Here endeth," much more loudly than I'd meant. The echoes snigger briefly. Back at the door, I sign the book, donate an Irish sixpence, reflect the place was not worth stopping for. Yet, stop I did. In fact, I often do. And always end much at a loss like this, wondering what to look for, wondering too when churches fall completely out of use, what we shall turn them into. if we shall keep a few cathedrals chronically on show, their parchment plate and pyx in locked cases, and let the rest rent free to rain and sheep, shall we avoid them as unlucky places? Or after dark will dubious women come to make their children touch a particular stone, pick simples for a cancer, or on some advised night see walking a dead one? Power of some sort or other will go on, in games, in riddles, seemingly at random. But superstition, like belief, must die. And what remains when disbelief has gone? Grass, weedy pavement, brambles, buttress, sky. A shape less recognizable each week, a purpose more obscure. I wonder who will be the last, the very last, to see this place for what it was. One of the crew that tap and jot and know what Rudolphs were, some ruined bibber, randy for antique, or Christmas addict, counting on a whiff of gown and bands and organ pipes and myrrh. Or will he be my representative, bored, uninformed, knowing the ghostly silt dispersed, yet tending to this cross of ground through suburb scrub, because it held unspilt so long and equably what since it's found only in separation, marriage, and birth, and death, and thoughts of these, for which was built this special shell. For though I've no idea what this accoutred frowsty barn is worth, it pleases me to stand in silence here. A serious house on serious earth it is, in whose blent air all our compulsions meet, are recognised and robed as destinies. And that much never can be obsolete, since someone will forever be surprising a hunger in himself to be more serious, and gravitating with it to this ground, which, he once heard, was proper to grow wise in, if only that so many dead lie round. Just as I did that last line, the lights did indeed go off down the bottom here, and I definitely just cacked my pants. Like I said, I don't know what Pete's sort of overall feeling was about God, about religion, about life, about death, and I didn't get to see him at the very end. And I don't know if people change. I'm sure that they might do, but one thing's for sure, it's a wonderful poem, and one that I used to really enjoy sitting and talking it through with him. I feel like he said the thing that he loved the most about this poem was that it really did capture the essence of what it felt like to be wanting more and not knowing whether or not it was there. And Larkin so eloquently, as he always does, captures that sense of doubt, the powerful sense of doubt, and yet the yearning and the hoping for something more. That's not to make this poem overly simplistic. It's a lot more than that. But that final line definitely hits differently. The idea of so many dead lying round. The dead outnumber the living quite a bit. And I think when you start seeing people that you know going from one side to the next, it can be quite a shock to think that you're, at one point going to join them, and what you do with that time is completely up to you, really. As Larkin said, time torn off unused, or life is first boredom, then fear. Whether or not we use it, it goes. But there's something about this first poem of the sort of, I feel like it's the first of Larkin's harder poems that I read, and really sort of remember wrestling with it for a long time. And again, one of the things that definitely happened after Pete and I first started sort of swapping emails was that he'd said, oh, as you're doing a dissertation on Larkin, I'm assuming that you've read this and this collection, and you've definitely read this. And much to my shame, I hadn't sought out some of his older poems, some of his earlier ones, and actually I'll go on record and say some of Larkin's really early stuff I didn't think was all that good. Like a lot of poets, they take a while to find their voice. And yeah, for me, Churchgoing is one of his earlier poems that really smashes it and is superb. There's a cadence to it which I think gets a little bit boggy in the middle in terms of how much detail he's trying to fit in, but it is also supremely rich. And this church is actually, not that I go around rating churches, this church is far better for the purposes. It's very similar size to the one I was on up in Newnham when I did it for the Philip Larkin Society. This is a bit more. It has a lot of the stuff in the poem. It has this slightly musty smell, but the coolness of it, because of the hot weather we've been having, really adds a sense of how a stone building can still completely capture that. And also we're right out in some fields here, and I can really smell the wildflowers coming through, and and there are indeed some brownish looking flowers in the windowsill here. It's a wonderful poem and a wonderful sentiment, and I think it's one of the things that I always think about with my friendship of sorts when it came to Pete, was actually that I felt I never actually had the courage to ask him about some of the bigger questions, because there was a sense of, are we friends now? Can we talk like mates? I never actually asked him that question. I never said, by the way, are we friends? Because it's the kind of thing you ask when you're about 10. But that was how I felt. I admired him so much, and I didn't want to break the spell, if you like. Which is very foolish now I think about it, but I sort of couldn't really believe that he'd want to actually hang out with me, and of course it took over 10 years of us doing exactly that for me to go, oh, okay, maybe he does actually want to spend time with me. He doesn't think what I'm saying is utter tosh, at least not all the time. But that was for you, Pete. I think it's one for everybody, atheists, agnostics, believers. I don't think that it doesn't take a swipe at religion in a cheap way. If anything, it takes a swipe at the prospect of not believing, and also not just belief, but what is belief. It's a stunner of a poem, and if you could only see this place, we've got this late afternoon sun coming in. I've got the place all to myself, and the lights are very much off, and we don't need them. But yeah, I can see what she was saying about this place becoming very, very dark. There's only 3 windows in this whole place. Anyway, time to go and trundle back through a bit of suburb scrub while I figure out what the final poem will be. I was looking in my fridge for the appropriate drink to do this final poem to, and to toast Pete, and not a beer I usually drink, but I happened to find some St. Peter's Golden Ale, so it seemed perfect to me. I wanted to do this in the Wickham Arms, but the more I thought about it, the more I realised that it would end up being potentially a bit too noisy. Could have taken away from what I was planning on doing, and I'll see Pete's picture in there, I hope, for many, many times to come. So instead I've come out to the Riley Arms, which, thankfully, because I am the landlord and proprietor, and it's mostly sole customer, I can get away with lighting a candle down the end of the bar. I've poured a little drink for myself, poured a little bit of whiskey, which I would not normally do, but I am on holiday as of tomorrow, and I felt like it was only right to do this with a proper drink. So, this has been quite a slog, and if you're still listening, then well done you, and thank you. Thank you for indulging me. Thank you for indulging my sadness, but also a desire to make something out of something that's sad. I really, really wrestled with what the final poem was going to be, and I went back and forth, because one of them, I really wanted it to be a poem that I could do in situ in a right place. And I am going to do this poem again. It will be its own standalone episode because I will be going to the place where it is set. It's one of the few Larkin poems that has an exact place in mind, which makes it awkward to do anywhere else. Or at least it would be. But I think it's the right poem to see this episode out. Before I do that, because I want the final words of this episode to be Larkin's rather than mine, I'm just going to say a few final words about Pete. I was always really bad, and have always been really bad at saying goodbye. I find it really hard. So, Pete, thank you for all of your friendship and kindness over the years. I really miss you. And if there is an afterlife, I really hope that you and my dad and Big Phil himself are all propping up the bar, having a pint, and laughing at what a wuss I am. I sincerely hope I get to see you again. I spoke with Pete's wife about something. I really wanted to try and get the ending of this right, and one thing that she said, and it was quite spooky, she said, you know what, in terms of things that he really loved, have you ever thought of having some music? And I guess normally this podcast is done without that sort of thing. But actually, it got me thinking, and I said, is there any kind of classical music that would work? Maybe the final poem I could have some music piping in, and it would sort of see us out. And it was so strange, because while I was having this text conversation with her, I had Classic FM on in the background, and they started to play Vaughan Williams' The Lark Ascending. And within about 20 minutes, she messaged me back and said, oh, well, the song we had playing at his funeral was in fact The Lark Ascending. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read this poem, and maybe towards the end I'm going to start allowing this music to pipe in, and the last words that you hear will be the final words of the poem. And if you want to stick around and listen to a truly exquisite piece of classical music, please do. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you down the road, I hope. An Arundel tomb. Side by side, their faces blurred, the Earl and Countess lie in stone, their proper habits vaguely shown, as jointed armour, stiffened pleat, and that faint hint of the absurd, the little dogs under their feet. Such plainness of the pre-Baroque hardly involves the eye until it meets his left-hand gauntlet still clasped empty in the other, and one sees, with a sharp, tender shock, his hand withdrawn, holding her hand. They would not think to lie so long. Such faithfulness in effigy was just a detail friends would see, a sculptor's sweet, commissioned grace, thrown off in helping to prolong the Latin names around the base. They would not guess how early in their supine stationary voyage the air would change to soundless damage. Turn the old tenantry away, how soon succeeding eyes begin to look, not read. Rigidly they persisted, linked through lengths and breadths of time. Snow fell undated, light each summer thronged the glass. A bright litter of bird calls strewed the same bone-riddled ground, and up the paths the endless altered people came, washing at their identity. Now, helpless in the hollow of an unmemorial age, a trough of smoke in slow suspended skeins above their scrap of history, only an attitude remains. Time has transfigured them into untruth. The stone fidelity they hardly meant has come to be their final blazon. And to prove our almost instinct, almost true, what will survive of us is love.